The Butcher of Eldridge Street. In the old, forgotten part of town, where the buildings leaned tiredly against each other and the streets whispered of days gone by, there stood a dilapidated butcher shop on Eldridge Street. It had once been the pride of the neighborhood, known for its fine cuts and the genial nature of its owner, Mr. Thomas Blackburn. Mr. Blackburn had been a staple of the community, always greeting his customers with a warm smile and a story. However, as years passed, a shadow fell over him. Whispers of tragedy, the loss of his family in a fire, turned his warm demeanor cold and his bright eyes dull. The townsfolk began to notice a change in him, a darkness that seemed to grow with each passing day. One fateful night, something inside Mr. Blackburn snapped. The townspeople woke to the sounds of manic laughter and the sickening scent of rotting meat coming from the direction of the butcher shop. Those brave enough to venture near reported seeing Blackburn, apron-stained and cleaver in hand, wildly hacking at chunks of meat that looked disturbingly unusual. The authorities were called, but by the time they arrived, Blackburn had vanished, leaving behind a butcher shop splattered with gore and filled with the stench of death. No trace of him was found, and the butcher shop was promptly closed, soon falling into disrepair. From then on, a macabre legend took root in the town. It was said that the ghost of Mr. Blackburn roamed Eldridge Street, particularly near the old butcher shop. His spectre was described as a hulking figure in a bloodied apron, with wild eyes and a cleaver that gleamed even in the moonless night. The legend also spoke of a curse. It was said that if you saw the ghost of the butcher, you should run for your life, for he was known to chop off a hand of those he caught. Many dismissed this as mere superstition, a tale to scare children, but the unnerving aura around the abandoned butcher shop suggested otherwise. As years passed, the story of the Butcher of Eldridge Street became a local legend, often shared during late-night gatherings and Halloween haunts. However, for Jonah, a young and skeptical journalist, the story presented an opportunity to make a name for himself. He decided to spend a night near the old butcher shop, hoping to either debunk the legend or capture something sensational. Armed with a camera and a flashlight, Jonah set out on a chilly October night. The streets were eerily quiet as he approached the abandoned shop. The building loomed ominously, its windows like dark, unblinking eyes, and the once vibrant sign now faded and peeling. As the clock struck midnight, a thick fog began to roll in, enveloping the street in a ghostly shroud. Jonah's flashlight barely pierced the gloom. He felt a chill run down his spine, not from the cold, but from the sensation of being watched. Then he heard it, the sound of a cleaver being sharpened, echoing in the silent street. Gripping his camera tightly, he turned towards the sound, and that's when he saw him. The ghost of Mr. Blackburn, just as the legend described, his apron stained, his eyes wild, and the cleaver in his hand dripping with ethereal blood. Paralyzed with fear, Jonah watched as the ghostly butcher advanced towards him, a grim smile playing on his lips. Remembering the legend, Jonah turned and ran as fast as he could, the sound of maniacal laughter and heavy footsteps close behind him. He didn't stop running until he reached the more populated part of town, gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his chest. Looking down, he realized he had dropped his camera in the chaos, but he didn't dare go back for it. The next day, Jonah shared his tale, but without evidence it was met with skepticism. Some believed him, adding his story to the legend of the Butcher of Eldridge Street, while others dismissed it as an imaginative fabrication. However, Jonah knew what he had seen and felt. He knew the terror that lurked on Eldridge Street. As for the butcher shop, it remained standing, a silent sentinel to a horror that once walked its floors. And to this day, it's said that if you find yourself on Eldridge Street after dark, you should be wary, for the ghost of Mr. Blackburn might still be looking for his next victim to dismember. In the heart of a forgotten village, veiled by the overgrowth of time, stood an ancient schoolhouse. Its walls were lined with ivy, its windows dusty and cracked, a relic of a bygone era. The locals spoke of the schoolhouse in hushed, reverent tones, for it was said that after dark, the empty halls and derelict classrooms came alive with the echoes of the past. The legend held that if one were brave enough to walk past the schoolhouse at night, they would glimpse through the windows a spectral scene of a time long past, ghostly figures of teachers imparting knowledge to classrooms filled with eager, ethereal students. The spirits were caught in an endless loop of teaching and learning, forever bound to the schoolhouse. John, a newcomer to the village, was fascinated by these tales. He was a young man, skeptical of superstitions, driven by an insatiable curiosity about the paranormal. The stories of the schoolhouse intrigued him, and he made it his mission to uncover the truth behind the spectral phenomena. One crisp autumn evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast the village in twilight, John set out for the schoolhouse. The villagers warned him against it, their eyes wide with fear, but he dismissed their concerns as mere folklore. As he approached the schoolhouse, the air grew colder and a dense fog began to roll in, enveloping the building in a ghostly shroud. John paused, a shiver running down his spine, not from the cold, but from the anticipation of what he might discover. Through the fog, he could see faint lights flickering in the windows and hear the distant sounds of lessons being taught and students reciting their studies. It was as if the schoolhouse had awoken from its long slumber and was reliving its former glory. With a deep breath, John pushed open the creaking front door and stepped inside. The interior was shrouded in darkness, save for the flickering candlelight that emanated from the classrooms. As his eyes adjusted, he saw them, the ghostly figures of teachers and students, dressed in the attire of a century ago, completely absorbed in their eternal lessons. John wandered the halls, an invisible observer to the spectral scenes unfolding in each classroom. In one room, a ghostly teacher discussed Shakespeare. In another, students practiced their penmanship with quill and ink. It was a mesmerizing sight, a window into a world that no longer existed. Drawn by an inexplicable force, John entered one of the classrooms. The spirit of a stern-looking teacher presided over rows of diligent students. Among them, he noticed an empty seat, and, driven by a sense of belonging he couldn't explain, he sat down. As he took his seat, the atmosphere shifted. The spectral figures, previously unaware of his presence, turned their gaze towards him. The teacher, her eyes hollow yet piercing, addressed John directly, welcoming him to her class. John tried to rise to leave the room, but found himself immobilized, his body refusing to obey his commands. Panic set in as he realized he was no longer an observer, but had become part of the spectral classroom. Outside, the villagers noticed the light in the schoolhouse had grown brighter. A few brave souls ventured closer and peered through the windows. What they saw sent chills down their spines. John, seated in the classroom, his figure flickering like a candle flame, caught between the living world and the spectral plane of the schoolhouse. Attempts were made to enter the schoolhouse and rescue John, but each time they were met with an impenetrable force. John was never seen outside the schoolhouse again. To this day, if one dares to peer through the schoolhouse windows after dark, they can see him, seated in the classroom, listening intently to the ghostly teacher, a permanent student of the eternal class. The old schoolhouse still stands, a monument to the past and a warning to the curious. Its classrooms remain filled with the spirits of a bygone era, and among them sits John, forever learning, forever trapped in the spectral embrace of the eternal classroom. In the rural outskirts of the small town of Marrow Creek, there stood an ancient farmhouse, surrounded by fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. The farmhouse, with its peeling paint and creaky floorboards, had been the home of the Morgan family for generations. Among its current residents were two brothers, Eli and Caleb, known for their adventurous spirits and inseparable bond. Every Hallows Eve, a chilling tradition unfolded at the Morgan farmhouse. As the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the fields in an eerie twilight, a dense, ghostly fog would roll in from the west, swallowing the landscape in its cold embrace. Accompanying this fog was a spectral sight that had become the subject of many local legends. A phantom horse and carriage, spectral in its appearance, with horses that seemed to gallop on air and a carriage that glowed with an otherworldly light. Eli, the elder of the two brothers, was 15, bold and fearless, with a mischievous glint in his eye. Caleb, 2 years his junior, was more reserved, often finding himself reluctantly swept up in Eli's daring escapades. Each Hallows Eve, they would sit on their creaky front porch, wrapped in blankets, watching in a mix of awe and apprehension as the ghostly carriage turned down their long driveway and paused in front of their house. No one knew the origins of this haunting procession, but it had been a phenomenon passed down through generations of Morgans. The brothers were cautioned never to leave the safety of the porch, for the old folk tales spoke of dire consequences for those who dared to approach the carriage. On one particularly chilling Hallows Eve, as the brothers took their usual place on the porch, Eli's curiosity overcame his caution. "This time I'm getting on," he declared with a determined edge to his voice. Caleb tried to dissuade him, his words laced with fear, but Eli's decision was firm. He was resolved to uncover the mystery of the phantom carriage. As the clock struck midnight, the fog rolled in, thicker and colder than ever before. The unearthly clip-clop of hooves echoed through the night, and the ghostly carriage emerged from the mist, its ethereal glow casting long, twisted shadows across the farmhouse. Eli stood up, his heart pounding with a mix of excitement and fear. As the carriage pulled up in front of the house, he took a deep breath and stepped off the porch, crossing the boundary that no Morgan had dared to cross on Hallows Eve. Caleb watched, frozen in terror, as Eli approached the carriage. The ghostly driver, shrouded in a tattered cloak, remained motionless, its face hidden in the shadows. Eli reached out a trembling hand and pulled open the carriage door, stepping inside. The moment Eli disappeared into the carriage, a howling wind erupted, causing the trees to bend and moan as if in warning. The horses neighed, a sound that seemed to come from another world, and the carriage door slammed shut. With a jolt, the carriage took off, galloping up the driveway and disappearing into the thick fog, taking Eli with it. Caleb ran after it, his cries for his brother lost in the wind. But it was no use. The carriage had vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving no trace behind. Devastated and alone, Caleb returned to the porch, where the chill of the night seeped into his bones. The next morning, the fog had lifted, but Eli was nowhere to be found. The townsfolk searched the fields and woods, but it was as if the earth had swallowed him whole. Caleb was inconsolable, racked with guilt for not stopping his brother. Years passed, and each Hallows Eve, Caleb would sit on the porch, a hollow echo of the boy he once was, waiting in vain for the carriage to bring Eli back. But the carriage never returned, its mystery forever unexplained, its passenger never released from its ghostly grasp. To this day, the legend of the haunted carriage of Marrow Creek lives on, a chilling tale of curiosity and loss, a reminder of the thin veil between the world of the living and the realm of the unknown. And in the old farmhouse, now worn and abandoned, the spirit of Caleb still waits on the porch, eternally hoping for his brother's return.